Good evening, President Obama. Good evening, Bruce Springsteen. Thanks for taking the time for us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Mr. President, you're known for breaking into song on stages. You admit in the book and in the podcast to singing in the shower. What's your favorite Bruce Springsteen song you like to sing in the shower?
Well, you know what? I've got a bunch of them. The Rising is a great song. A Promised Land is a great song. I'm on Fire, I've been known to sing to Michelle, because that's kind of a sexy song.
So, Bruce, have you ever considered taking him on tour as backup vocals?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we're trying to work that out for 2022. We'll be coming to Germany, and President Obama will be in the backing choir.
Is that a threat or a promise?
More of a threat, clearly. Yeah.
All right, but seriously now, two of the most famous American voices of our time decide to join forces and have a conversation about personal but also pressing American issues. What was your motivation behind this project?
Well, Bruce and I have been friends since he generously campaigned for me back in 2008. I wasn't yet president. I was running for president. We got to know each other. Our families got to know each other. What struck me was that Bruce, as much as any musical artist, I think is a chronicler of American life, a storyteller that captures a lot of the contradictions and troubles, but also dreams and hopes of ordinary people across the country. And at a time when we were in the middle of a pandemic, great turmoil politically, I thought that maybe the two of us having a conversation, coming from very different backgrounds, but having a similar sensibility and a similar love for the country, a critical love, but an abiding love for America, that it might be useful for people to listen to us talk and have a sense of the road we had traveled, but also the road the country's traveled, and where we thought we were at this point in our history, and where we might go.
And Bruce, what was your motivation?
Well, when I first saw President Obama as a senator, he just struck me as somebody who was speaking to the country that I believed in and had put my faith and hope in. So campaigning for him in first 2008 was something that was a pleasure and an honor for me. I felt we shared a lot of the same values. I felt that President Obama was a politician that really, as Abraham Lincoln said, was speaking to the better angels of America. And we were at a place in time when that was a critical voice. And I came out on the campaign trail and I performed a few songs. I was his opening act. And after that, we had some social occasions where we had some long conversations, and it really seemed we had quite a bit in common. So the podcast was originally Barack's idea, and at first I thought he made a mistake. I said, gee, wait a minute, I'm a high school graduate from Freehold, New Jersey who plays the guitar. I think the president dialed the wrong number, But once we got into the conversations, we realized we had quite a bit in common, and it was a wonderful experience.
You have a bit in common. You obviously share similar views. But Mr. President, why did you decide to do this project then with Bruce Springsteen? Why two people who are basically preaching to each other's choir? Why not choose someone with an opposing view, both to challenge yourself, but also to offer your audience both sides of an argument?
Well, the goal here wasn't to have a political debate. That's not the purpose. I guarantee you I've had a lot of political debates and a lot of occasion to talk to people with different views. I think the point here was to try to excavate, try to lift up a shared story of America. As you know, we talk about in the podcast and in the book, Bruce and I have very different backgrounds, but and I always remind him he's a little older than me, so we're not exactly the same generation, but we do have a common baseline of having grown up in post-World War II America, seen this incredible activism from the bottom up to include more and more people in the American story. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, more recently the movement for gays and lesbians and transgender persons. The sense that for both Bruce and I, the country had moved to include more and more people at the table. Their voices were being heard, and that was a good thing, and that was a strength of America. It's what makes us exceptional, is we have people from every corner of the globe who arrive here with hopes and dreams and struggles, and somehow, so far at least, that experiment in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and cultural democracy has held together. And I think my interest is not simply to score political points or win a political argument, but to try to remind ourselves of what are the formative stories that we hold in common. And so in the book we talk about the idea that you can chase your dreams and succeed. The notion of this idea that in America anything's possible. The tension between the open road and the idea of individualism versus the idea of community and staying put and putting down roots. And a lot of that is embodied in music. One of America's greatest gifts to the world is our music, and it's a great gift because it captures all the contradictions of the country, and Bruce exemplifies that because he draws on all kinds of different musical traditions. So those are the kinds of things that I think we wanted to dig into. The goal here was not to make a political or analytical argument about where the country goes to, but more of an emotional argument about what we thought was best in the country, and to fight off cynicism, because I think right now there is a moment where a lot of people feel cynical about the American project. And Bruce, underlying some of his darker lyrics, he's basically a fighting optimist like me, to use a phrase he
the book
used the other day.
It's primarily not a political book. It's just a book about life, and aspirations and our roots, and the country in a more general sense, So it's not fundamentally a political book. I'm way behind the ball on that. So.
Mm-hmm. And yet so many things are political right now. Even the pandemic and how it's handled is being seen very politically. I was just asking because I was wondering maybe it could help people see how to have a conversation nowadays, because that's one thing even here in Germany sometimes becomes more and more difficult, it seems, that people are not even talking to each other across the aisle of the political spectrum.
Well, it's interesting. We talk about this in the book. When Bruce and I grew up, America still had a monoculture, right? When Elvis goes on the Ed Sullivan Show, the whole country sees it. When there's the moon landing, everybody watches it. You have 3 television stations, all of which abide by the same general rules of journalism. And so part of what we had was a shared culture. Now, that culture excluded a lot of people, and a lot of voices weren't heard. It was racist and it was sexist, and so there are all kinds of reasons why, both technological and culturally, why that changed during our lifetimes. But the big challenge right now is that oftentimes we don't even see the same things. If you watch Fox News in America, then you have a completely different set of facts, not just opinions, but facts about how the world is operating, compared to if you read the New York Times. And that's one of the challenges of social media. And so part of what I think we have to do to get back to a better conversation is figure out, are there ways in this new internet world to at least arrive at some common facts and a common baseline of knowledge. And that's been, that's tougher to achieve, although it's still achieved in music to a large degree. Go ahead,
Well,
Bruce.
it's a tremendous challenge. I mean, the town that I grew up in, little blue-collar American town, 10,000 people. That town now is probably, it's 40% Hispanic, which has changed over the past 20 years. So there's been the speed of the cultural and technological change, the post-industrialization of the country has left a lot of people disenfranchised and alienated. So I think the general idea behind the book was, once again, how do we arrive at some common narrative, at some common vision of the country that can bring us a little more together than constantly pull us apart at this time. You're right, it's a very, very divisive time in America and around the world. And the book it's my 2 cents at trying to find some common ground.
Your music might be the only thing that my Democratic American wife and my father-in-law, who's a Trump-voting staunch Republican, can agree on, and that's something that brings them together. You can imagine the conversations. But Bruce, your whole life has been about giving blue-collar America, the working class, a voice. Songs like Youngstown, The River, all about that. But in a way, you appeal directly to the classic Democratic voting base. Has gone away a little bit, yet we've seen that, especially in the 2016 election of Donald Trump, that a lot of these people have turned away from the Democrats, turned away from you because of your political stance. There's a #1 country song out now that goes, "Am I the only one who quit singing along when they play another Springsteen song?" How does it make you feel? What do you make of that?
Well, I grew up in a Democratic household, and not a political household. My household was the only political question. I came home from school one day and I asked my parents if we were Democrats or Republicans. And I always remember my mother saying, we're Democrats because they're for the working people. And that was the end of the political conversations in my house. But I carried it with me for the rest of my life. And I think the alienation that you're talking about, there's a lot of folks who feel disenfranchised. And I believe that from my point of view, I would say that if you go back to the 60s, and then when the Republican Party came up with something that was called the Southern Strategy, where they decided that social and cultural issues were the ways to divide blue-collar people against other blue-collar people, white people against black people and brown people, and that this was a way to sustain their power. That is stone cold what we're seeing in the United States at this moment, And if you are on hard times, and if you are faced with a deeply changing country, the most common thing to do is to experience that change as decline, which it not necessarily is. And it's very important to try to come up with those common stories. I've tried to do it in my music for the past 40 years. But that alienation, I believe, has been a cynical social and cultural play by politicians to remain in power. And it's gotten to where it couldn't be any it couldn't be any clearer than it is at this moment when we're literally in the United States. We're at the mercy of just incredibly bizarre conspiracy theories, lies being absolutely knowingly sold to a trusting electorate, and dividing the country in a deeply disturbing way.
Let me say this, though, Ingo. The one thing I do want to say is there are an awful lot of folks who are working class folks who still listen to Bruce Springsteen songs.
Yes.
and I think it's also important, even in our own terminology. Sometimes we refer to the working class. Well, who's the biggest percentage who is almost entirely working class are black people and brown people in this country. But when we talk working class, I think oftentimes the subtext is the white working class, and that then you have minority voters. Well, no, the people who are cleaning, hotel rooms and are working as orderlies in hospitals and so forth, those are a whole bunch of working people too. So what I do think, as Bruce said, has happened, and this is not unique to the United States. Obviously, we're seeing it in Europe. You saw it in Brexit. You saw it in the most recent German election. Is that there is a sense among white voters, particularly those who are blue collar, that they are losing ground. Some of their concerns and complaints are justified because it has to do with globalization, the loss of manufacturing, the loss of in the United States, the loss of bargaining power because unions have been weakened. And as Bruce said, there is a long history in the United States, dates back 300 years, of when there's dissatisfaction among that group, pointing to black people or brown people and saying they're the problem, and scapegoating them. And in Europe, obviously, we're seeing, with respect to anti-immigration sentiment, similar things. But the one thing that I always try to remind myself, what I've tried to do in my politics, and what I think Bruce does in his music, is to understand that all of us have those instincts of anger, resentment, looking at other people suspiciously as because they don't look like us or worship the way we do. But we also have good impulses in us too. And those same people who may be right now enthralled by conspiracy theories or being fed a bunch of nonsense, those are also people who love their families, who work hard, are responsible, who care about future generations. And so then the question is, can we reconnect with them?
Exactly. That's my question too, Mr. President, because now we obviously are talking about two competing visions of what America stands for, what it should be, what it means to be American, or what it means to be patriotic. So in your conversations, and the epitome was the storming of the Capitol of that, how do you reconcile it? Did you find solutions in what you were talking about?
Well, but keep in mind, some of those same folks you're talking about voted for me. There are actually people who a fairly sizable cohort who are Obama-Trump voters, right? Which sounds strange, but it's true. And I think that's part of what we talked a lot about in this book is there are these contradictory strands in America, like all countries. But I think maybe in America they're a little more extreme. They're more prominent, those contradictions, because we were founded on a contradiction. The idea was, we the people, and all of us are created equal, and yet we had slavery, and we had Jim Crow, and we had native peoples whose cultures were decimated and destroyed. And so those two things have always been at war. And I think when Bruce quoted Abraham Lincoln talking about the better angels of our nature, what typically has happened in our history is that sometimes the worst demons of our nature come to the fore, and sometimes the better natures, the better angels come out. And but I think that it's important for us to remind ourselves that those better angels are still there, and that's a lot of what we talk about. It's captured in our music, it's captured in our stories, it's captured in the Declaration of Independence, it's captured in one of the things that we talk about in the book was when I was at the funeral of those who had been shot in Charleston by a young white supremacist. And I sang Amazing Grace. And part of the reason that I did that was because that's a song that is an old English hymnal, and yet also captures this profound experience of the black church and being able to rise above tragedy. That's the best in us, and rock and roll is part of that too.
And yet, one of the things that have been repeatedly an issue in this country, in your country, is racism. You've touched upon it a couple of times now. Bruce, you've been singing about it for a long time in my hometown. So this racial divide that you also saw as you were growing up, Mr. President, do you see a change now? Has the killing of George Floyd, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, has that been a game changer?
No, I was just going to say, just to go back to what we were talking about for a second, was I come out on tour in the United States, and in this area I may play to 100,000 people. They're not all Democrats. There'd be a lot of empty seats if I was only playing to Democrats here in America. I get a lot of Republican fans, and as Barack says, some of those folks at the Capitol probably voted for Barack Obama and probably have listened to my music. So I tend to feel like the president does, that there's room for common ground, and as when you come to discuss race is fascinating. I mean, music is one of the places where racial differences seem to it all gets put on hold when you hear it. So when I was a kid, I used to say, like, when Motown music came on, great black music out of Detroit, everybody was on the dance floor, white kids, black kids, and it was a moment when the common values and the common ground of that music was felt and experienced by everyone. Music at its center. What I do on a given night is I create a space where people can experience common values, a common narrative, and common ground. The trick is getting them to take that with them when they leave. And I think you're looking at a moment where I got a young son, 30. He was on the street during the George Floyd Black Lives Matter demonstrations. I think if you look at America, the questions of race and our racial relations are far better today than they were in 1950 or 1960. I think the fact that it's tumultuous at this moment, that it's been brought to the front is a sign that things are changing. Things change slow, way too slow, and it's always a step up and a few steps back. But but racially, it's a much more. I think it's a fairer country now than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, and Ingo, just to answer your question real quickly, I don't think that George Floyd was a game changer in the sense that suddenly all of the racial division and discrimination in this country has gotten fixed any more than my election was a game changer. As I think some people were describing after my election a post-racial America. I certainly wasn't one of those people, because these things are deep. They go back not just decades, but centuries. And so what you see is a social evolution. And what I do believe, and you know, we actually end the book with this discussion of our children. You know, the generation that's coming behind us, their attitudes around race are profoundly different, I think, than our generation or our parents' generation. I think they naturally, instinctively, are more likely to believe in treating people with dignity and respect regardless of race. That's not 100%, but I would say that when you look at surveys of attitudes, there is a profound difference in this generation coming together. And during the George Floyd demonstrations, that was part of what was striking was the degree to which those who were on the streets weren't just black folks or brown folks. It was a whole bunch of folks who, you know, in previous iterations of civil rights demonstrations would not have been there. And that, I think, is a source of hope.
So I have one last question for you then. Mr. President, you're quoted as saying, the arc of history bends towards justice, but not in a straight line. Progress isn't linear. It zigs and it zags. I'm curious, are we seeing zigging or more zagging at the moment?
Well, we've been zagging, but I think we're ready for a zig.
Would you agree, Bruce?
Yes, but by the way, there is also a country song called Springsteen.
That will be sung.
So it's not quite as black and white as it seems.
We're going to have to check that out.
Okay. Mr. President, Bruce Springsteen, thank you so much for your time and for having this conversation.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.